Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of the Miss Information Podcast. My name is Zee, aka the Reluctant Accountant, and today's going to be a juicy one. So for today's episode, I really want to get into a subject matter that is, I wouldn't say it's uncharted territory. Certainly it has been charted, but it's always, from what I can see, been done in a very specific angle. And I'm going to talk about anti-Zionism and I'm going to talk about anti-Semitism. And I think I'm going to do this. I really want to talk about this subject because it's everywhere at the moment, especially after what happened on October the 7th. We can look all over social media, we can look all over the news, and we can see people either talking very directly about the situation or very indirectly and ignoring the situation. And there's been this kind of almost way to shut down the arguments, or arguments from evolving and becoming something that can actually be constructive, because no one's really allowed to dig beyond the surface of things. So whenever somebody positions themselves, for example, as an anti-Zionist, they are shouted down as either being pro-Hamas or they are shouted down as being anti-Semitic. And I want to deal with that kind of anti-Semitic correlation to begin with, because I think it's a misnomer. And I think there's definitely, when I'm looking at the way that anti-Zionists are, the majority of the anti-Zionist ideology that I see coming out is very much firmly positioned on Zionism as a political ideology, rather than anything to do with the religious correlation between Judaism and Zionism. And I say that in the knowledge that, yes, you can absolutely be anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist. They're not mutually exclusive, but nor are they definitely correlative in a way that people tend to assert. And I think it's really important that we are allowed to critique these things and allowed to look beyond the surface, because what I want to do when I'm focusing this episode is actually not to talk about Jewish people, not to talk about the Jewish movement at all, but actually focus on Christians, and to be more specific, on Christian evangelists. So modern Zionism was officially established in 1897 by Theodor Herzl as a political organization. He was a Jewish journalist and political activist who believed that Jewish people couldn't survive if they didn't have their own nation. So Herzl organized the first Zionist Congress in Basel in Switzerland, and he also became the first president of the World Zionist Organization. So although he died in 1904, before he ever came to see the creation of a Zionist or Israel state, he is thought to be the father of Zionism. And I think when people think about Zionism and Israel, there is a inability, if you like, to divorce this formation of a Jewish state, quote unquote, from the political ideologies and the political positioning and policies that are coming out of this said state. So, as I said, what I want to do is take this away from Jewish people and looking at Jewish people, and I want to look at Christian evangelicals and the role they play in the support of Israel and Zionism, and also why, whilst anti-Zionists often position themselves as being anti-political ideology and want to completely divorce it from religion, in a roundabout way, the political ideology is very much being pushed by religion, although perhaps not the one that most people think. So to give it some perspective, I think I want to take it and look at Christian evangelicals, or Christian Zionists rather, in the US. Now, by latest estimates, it's said that there are 10 million Christian Zionists in the United States of America. And to give you some perspective on that, there are only actually 7 million Jewish people in the United States of America. So this idea that even if every single Jewish person in the United States was a Zionist, and we know that they're not, but even if they were, they still would be far outweighed by the number of Christian Zionists. So I want to hold on those figures, but I also want to make it clear that there are Christian evangelicals across the globe. In fact, the majority of Christian evangelicals are in the global south. There are many in Brazil, in South Africa, and also in Nigeria and other places. So again, there's a little bit of food for thought. But let's bring it back to this. Why do Christian evangelicals support the state of Israel? So to really understand the Christian evangelical support of the state of Israel, you have to kind of bring it back to religious philosophy or religion. So when modern people and most people think of Zionism, there is this kind of unwavering correlation or association with the creation of a Jewish state, a Jewish nation. However, for Christian evangelicals, this religious underpinning comes from their interpretation of the Bible, specifically the passages that relate to the return of Jews to their Holy Land as part of God's plan and the second coming of Jesus Christ. So Christian Zionists believe that Israel's existence is essential to God's plan and this biblical prophecy unfolding, including the eventual rapture and the return of Jesus Christ. And this belief system over the past few decades has become popularized by figures such as John Hagee, who is a televangelist. He is the head of an organization called Christians United for Israel and often uses Bible verses such as Genesis 12:3 to swat away arguments against supporting Israel. And if you're unsure what that Bible verse is, I will tell you. It's when they believe God said, "I will bless those who bless Israel, and I will curse those who curse Israel."
And the people imagine a vain thing. The kings of the earth, this would be Russia and China, have set themselves against the Lord and against his anointed, that would be Israel. Listen, and he who sits in the heavens shall laugh. God is going to laugh and ridicule these armies that come against Israel. And then he says, he will break them with a rod of iron and shall crush them to pieces like a potter's vessel. Hello, China, Russia, Iran, Turkey. The day you lift your hand to attack Israel, God Almighty is going to crush you.
And it's very interesting, actually, and I know I'm trying to focus on the US, but if we look at those Christian evangelists in the global south, that is a real tangible thing for them. So they take this verse very, very seriously. When they say, "I will bless those who bless Israel and curse those who curse Israel," part of Israel's diplomacy is giving certain things to those nations and almost in a way playing on that belief system that they hold. Because when they say, "I will bless those who bless Israel," well, actually, if you're getting aid and other things from the Israeli government, then for you, that prophecy is coming to fulfillment. And that Bible verse is often seen as justification also from these Christian evangelists for the US political and financial support of Israel. So for these people, a US that doesn't support Israel, a US that doesn't provide what Israel needs, is not just a political misstep, it's actually a spiritual one with very, very serious consequences. So what does this have to do with political policy in the US? Well, unfortunately, quite a lot. So evangelicals make up quite a large proportion of the US population. At one point, they were at 25%, although recent figures say that it's down to about 14%, which is not in itself insignificant. And when it comes to politics, they are punching well above their weight politically. And guess what party they're aligning themselves with? The Republican Party. So over the past several decades, evangelicals have been key drivers of US support for Israel. Because for them, it isn't just about geopolitics. It's about fulfilling some sort of divine mandate. And if you think I'm just saying this, you can go online and see this. There are politicians such as Mike Huckabee and Donald Trump himself who have talked about the Christian evangelical support and the importance of that movement. So Huckabee, for example, even frequented tours of Israel, Christian tours of Israel, by the way, in which he's framing the Holy Land as some sort of spiritual and political home for Christians. If you want to see how that has influenced actual policy, you look no further than Trump moving the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. When this happened at the time, Trump openly acknowledged that most Americans, actually even most Jewish Americans, didn't agree with moving it there. And he actually said he's doing this for the Christians. He's doing this for the Christian evangelicals. And so this is where it gets complicated when people start talking about anti-Semitism, because evangelical support for Israel has very little to do with Jewish identity or Jewish security, and everything to do with biblical prophecy. So if we're thinking about the difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, at its core, Anti-Zionism is opposition to the political ideology of Zionism. That could be opposition to the way that the state of Israel was established. It could be opposition to Israel's policies, and particular regarding Palestinians. So for many people, including for many Palestinians, anti-Zionism is rooted in their displacement, occupation, and calls for justice, not in some hatred for Jews. But here's where the evangelical narrative complicates things. In the evangelical framework, criticism of Israel is often seen as criticism of God's plan and some way of attacking the fulfillment of God's plan. So when someone questions, for example, Israel or Israel's policies, it can be quickly conflated, especially within evangelical circles, with anti-Semitism. And the problem with this is that it shuts down discourse about Israel, about its actions, especially when it comes to human rights concerns in places like Gaza and the West Bank. And to go further on this, Christian evangelicals rather, don't even recognize the West Bank as it is, and they don't believe that the settlements that are there are illegal. They actually refer to that area by their biblical names of Judea and Samaria. And so they believe it's fine for Jewish people, these Jewish settlements, to be there because actually it was God's plan for Jewish people to return. And once again, I want to stress that there may very well be anti-Semitic elements in the anti-Zionist movement, but they are not one and the same. Anti-Semitism is hostility and prejudice and discrimination against Jewish people. Anti-Zionism is the opposition to the idea of a Jewish state, or specifically the actions of the Israeli government. And this is why the conflation is so dangerous, because once you do that, once you keep throwing out these accusations, what you do is you undermine the ability to have a legitimate discourse about the treatment of Palestinian people, for example. And it also diminishes the seriousness of real anti-Semitic hate. When I think about it, and I think about this discourse and how vehemently there's been this kind of, huge wave of support for not necessarily just Israeli people, but Zionism as we see it now, I kind of think about this weaponization that has been done, because I think that's what's happening. There has been a definite political weaponization of Israel and anti-Semitism in order for evangelicals to fulfill their religious ideological plan. And I want to make it clear, the evangelicals really do not care about Jewish people, nor do they care about Muslim people. They see the war and the fighting as a just war. And to put it bluntly, people dying on both sides is just collateral damage. They're using these phrases and these labels, such as being anti-Semitic, to throw around to achieve their cause and their objective, which have nothing to do, as I've mentioned, with the protection of Jewish people. And there are actually quite a few interpretations of evangelical prophecy in which it ends up really bad for everybody that is not Christian. So in the second coming of Christ, it is said that those people who are non-Christians, those people that are either non-Christian or do not convert, will face the rapture. To be clear, for Christian evangelicals, supporting the state of Israel is not necessarily about supporting the Jews per se. It's about supporting the prophecy, which doesn't necessarily benefit the Jews. There are interpretations of this prophecy that says Jews have to either convert to Christianity or they will face dire consequences during the second coming of Jesus Christ. So this raises this question: is this support for Israel really about the well-being of Jewish people, or is it about the fulfillment of a religious agenda? I think sometimes when I think about it, there is things I hear and information I hear online, whether that be in a podcast or whether that be on one of the kind of social media apps. And I think, can that be true? And then you start digging. And I'm very much somebody that wants to start digging, and I don't just want to hear one side of it. I want to hear the other side. I want to be that person that's like, I'm on this really dodgy page, but I want to see what they're saying. And the more that I heard about this, and I heard about, these Christian evangelicals, I've heard about them before in the past. I've seen, televangelist spouting whatever it is that they're spouting, and the kind of extremism that I see in religious extremism in the US being ignored as that as well. Like when we think of religious extremist, we rarely mention the United States, even though there is so much of their political policy that is driven by religious extremism. And recently we've been hearing a lot about, for example, Donald Trump and the Heritage Foundation and him saying certain things. And I want to draw your attention to something. The televangelist John Hagee, and I think I'm saying his name right, but if I'm not, you know what, whatever. I'll die in the rapture anyway, babe. Don't worry about it. So televangelist John Hagee goes on TV and he talks about, Genesis 12:3. He's talking about you mustn't curse Israel because God will curse you, yada, yada, yada. He also very specifically spoke about the rapture. And he said after the rapture, there will be 1,000 years of peace. There will be no more presidential elections. No more fake news, none of that nonsense. And again, we can just kind of, he's just like a little quack religious person, whatever. But I want you to think back to this campaign trail, because there was a time where Donald Trump himself came and said, don't worry, just vote for me and you'll never have to vote again.
Get your friends, get your family, get everyone you know and vote. Vote early. Vote absentee, vote on election day. I don't care how, but you have to get out and vote. And again, Christians, get out and vote just this time. You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years, you know what? It'll be fixed. It'll be fine. You won't have to vote anymore, my beautiful Christians. I love you, Christians. I'm a Christian. I love you. Get out. You got to get out and vote.
And many people were losing their shit. Like, people were losing their minds. They were like, he's going to get rid of democracy and whatever. And people tried to play it off and they were like, you're just scaremongering. It's fine. But what Donald Trump is actually doing is giving a nod to those evangelicals who have so much power, who have the power in the Republican Party, because they understand that language. They recognize that language because they're consuming it all the time. And so when we think about these things and when we hear these claims being made, sometimes they do seem so absurd that they can't even be real. We're like, this can't be real because it's so ridiculous. But I want you to remember how easily the rhetoric translates to political ideology and then ultimately political policy.
Vote. In 4 years, you don't have to vote again. We'll have it fixed so good you're not going to.
So I want to end by talking about why I think it matters that we have this distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, especially given this context of evangelical influence. I think the distinction is important so that we can maintain a healthy discourse when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, so that we can really look to find solutions and look to dig deep to root causes of issues and not skirt over it and not say it's just related to one incident that happened 12 months ago without any further context and without any regard for the drivers, the very real drivers that actually sit very much outside of the Jewish state itself and also outside of the Jewish religion. It's important that people realize that Christian evangelicals are highly invested in Zionism, but they are invested for largely theological reasons that have little to do with the modern Jewish identity or the complex politics of the region. And so what's essentially been happened is that this powder keg that is going on in terms of what's happening politically, what's happening on the ground in that region, is being utilized by people with a very separate agenda, and they're almost pushing this label of anti-Semitism to the forefront in order to shut down discourse and stop anybody really turning around and looking and going, where have you got that from? Why do you think like that? Essentially, when you frame anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, it becomes this political tool to silence people and silence political dissent. That not only limits the freedom of expression, the freedom of speech, it also dilutes the fight against anti-Semitism globally, which remains a problem. By acknowledging these distinctions, what we do is we create a space for thoughtful, nuanced critique and discussions on the Israel and Palestine conflict that can include various viewpoints and can be done so in earnest as a way to try to bring about real peace and a real long-lasting solution. And that discussion should include Palestinians, and Jewish people who are opposed to Zionism themselves, but that doesn't make them anti-Semitic. Thank you for joining me on this episode. That's all I've got time for today. And whilst, someone said to me, you always scratch the surface and you do a bit, but you don't go far enough on these things. First of all, we have time limits. Second of all, you should never be just listening to one voice anyway. My voice shouldn't be the one that you listen to and just settle on. This is the opportunity for you to go out and learn more and find out some information for yourself. So go and check out, the John Hagee and the Mike Huckabee, and look at Donald Trump's links to Christian evangelicals and their role in Zionism. But that's all I've got time for this week. Thank you again for joining me. If you would like to find me in other places, I am indeed on TikTok. I am on Instagram at The Reluctant Accountant. The handle is at The Reluctant Accountant. You can also email me if you like. It is the Misinformation Podcast at gmail.com. That's the Misinformation Podcast at gmail.com. But until next week, see you later.